Right. Ready to dive into something pretty interesting. It's a topic you were curious about.
Okay. I'm all ears.
It's heteroskedasticity.
Heteroskedasticity.
Yeah, in regression analysis.
Okay.
And I know,
Yeah.
the word itself is a mouthful.
It is a big one.
But trust me,
Yeah.
it's a concept that can really change how we look at data.
It really can it's like this hidden factor that can really just like totally skew how you're understanding what the data is telling you.
So let's just start with the basics before we get into the really nitty-gritty.
Okay, sounds good.
You know how some things in life are like super predictable?
Yeah.
Like like your commute to work every day.
Right, yeah, you can usually bet on hitting the same traffic lights at rush hour.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then there are other things that are way less predictable.
Totally.
Like the price of Bitcoin.
Oh, yeah, that's a roller coaster for sure.
Heteroskedasticity is all about how that level of predictability can change within the data itself.
Yeah.
So it's not just about whether something is predictable or not.
Right.
But about whether that predictability stays consistent.
Exactly. And the materials you shared had a really great example with household spending.
Okay.
And it highlighted that lower income households tend to have pretty predictable spending patterns because, so much of their budget goes to those like essential needs.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of wiggle room when most of your income is going to necessities.
Right. Exactly. But as you move up that income ladder, things get way more interesting.
Right.
Higher earners have more disposable income, so their spending can fluctuate more.
Yeah.
They might splurge on a big vacation one month.
Okay.
And then like really tighten the belt the next.
So the variability in their spending is actually dependent on their income level.
Yeah.
That's heteroskedasticity in action, right?
Yes, precisely.
Okay.
The variability of one factor is influenced by another.
Gotcha.
And this gets really important when we're talking about things like regression analysis, which is, this powerful tool that we use to try to find relationships and make predictions.
Okay, I'm starting to see why this matters.
Yeah.
But can we break that down a little further for me? Like, why exactly is heteroskedasticity a problem when it comes to regression analysis?
So think of it this way.
Okay.
Regression analysis relies on this assumption that the variability of the data points around that like line of best fit is pretty much constant.
So if we're trying to like predict something
Right.
like sales based on advertising spending,
Yes.
we're assuming that the accuracy of our predictions is like the same across the board.
Exactly. But when heteroskedasticity is present, that assumption kind of goes out the window.
Okay.
We can no longer assume that level of consistency because the scatter, that like noise in the data is changing.
So it's like our predictive power is strong in some areas but weak in others.
Precisely. And ignoring this can lead to some serious pitfalls. Like, if we don't account for heteroskedasticity, our regression results might actually look statistically significant when they're not, or we might underestimate the true uncertainty in our predictions.
Okay, so that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Especially if we're like using these analyses to make important decisions.
Absolutely. Imagine basing things like financial forecasts or public policy decisions on models that haven't considered this. The potential for flawed conclusions is huge.
So how do we even know if we're dealing with heteroskedasticity in the first place?
Right.
Like, are there any red flags we should be watching out for?
There are, and one of the most common ways is to visualize the data.
Okay.
If we plot those residuals, you know the difference between the actual data points and the model's predictions. We can often spot patterns.
No, we're not just looking at the raw data.
Right.
But how well our model fits that data.
Exactly. And one telltale sign of heteroskedasticity is a funnel shape in that residual plot.
Okay.
This indicates that the spread of the residuals is increasing or decreasing in a systematic way.
Okay, I see. So going back to the household spending example, that funnel shape might show that the residuals are smaller for lower income households because their spending is more predictable.
Right.
And then as income increases, the residuals get larger,
Yeah.
reflecting that wider variation in spending.
You got it spot on.
Okay.
Visual inspection is definitely a good starting point.
Yeah.
But we can also use statistical tests to confirm the presence of heteroskedasticity more formally.
Now, in the materials you shared, there was mention of like tests like the Brosh-Piggin test and the White test.
Right.
What are those tests actually telling us?
Those tests are looking at the relationship between the residuals from our model and those independent variables.
Okay.
And they're helping us determine if there's like evidence to suggest that the variance of those errors is systematically related to our predictors.
So it's like checking if the wonkiness of our ruler is changing depending on what we're trying to measure.
Exactly. And if those tests come back significant, it kind of strengthens our suspicion that heteroskedasticity is at play.
Okay, so let's say we've done our due diligence.
Yeah.
We've confirmed we have heteroskedasticity.
Right.
What happens next?
Yeah.
Like, how do we actually deal with it
Right.
and make sure our analysis is still reliable?
Well, fortunately, we've got several tools at our disposal.
Okay.
It's like having a toolbox full of different solutions.
Okay.
And the best one is going to depend on the specific situation.
Gotcha. And the materials you shared kind of outlined 4 main approaches.
Yes.
Robust standard errors.
Yep.
Weighted least squares. Data transformations.
Right.
And generalized least squares.
That's right.
So let's unpack those a bit.
Okay, let's start with robust standard errors.
Okay.
This is a really popular technique.
Okay.
And it's often very effective.
Okay.
So essentially what it does is it adjusts the standard errors of our regression coefficients.
Okay.
To account for the presence of that heteroskedasticity.
So it's like acknowledging that our ruler's a bit wonky. And then adjusting our measurements accordingly.
Precisely.
Okay.
And the beauty of robust standard errors is that it doesn't require us to know like the exact nature of the heteroskedasticity.
Gotcha.
It just provides this way to make our estimates more reliable, even if we don't know exactly what that heteroskedasticity looks like.
Sounds pretty handy.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there are situations where a more like tailored approach might be necessary.
Absolutely. And that's where weighted least squares, or WLS, comes in.
Okay.
If we have a good understanding of how that variance is changing across our data, we can actually use WLS to give more weight to those observations that are more reliable.
So it's like saying, hey, I know this part of my ruler is more accurate.
Right.
So I'm going to trust those measurements more.
Exactly. For instance, in our household spending example, we could assign higher weights to the data points from those lower income households.
Okay.
Since we know their spending patterns tend to be more predictable. Yeah.
And this would help to balance out the influence of the more variable data from those higher earners.
It's a really clever way to actually leverage the information we have about the data.
Yeah.
Now, what about data transformations?
Yeah.
I'm really intrigued by that one because it seems to kind of address the root of the problem.
They can be incredibly powerful.
Okay.
The idea is to apply a mathematical function to our data.
Okay.
To stabilize the variance.
Gotcha.
One common approach is to use like the logarithm of a variable.
Okay.
Especially when we're dealing with things like income or spending, which tend to have those skewed distributions.
So instead of like adjusting our measurements or weighting the data,
right,
we're actually trying to fix the wonky ruler itself.
Exactly. By transforming the data, we can often make it more amenable to regression analysis.
Yeah.
And reduce the impact of that heteroskedasticity.
Okay.
And the great thing is, sometimes a simple transformation can make a huge difference.
So we've got robust standard errors.
Yeah.
Weighted least squares.
Data transformations.
Yep.
That leaves us with generalized least squares.
Right.
Or GLS.
GLS.
This one sounds like it's the most advanced technique.
It is.
In our toolkit.
It allows us to explicitly model the structure of the heteroskedasticity.
Okay.
It's like we're creating a custom-made ruler that perfectly matches the shape of our data.
Oh. Okay, that's impressive.
Yeah.
But I imagine that requires a pretty deep level of statistical expertise.
It does. To effectively use GLS, we need a solid understanding of the underlying patterns of heteroskedasticity in our data. We need to specify a model for how that variance is changing, and that can get pretty complex.
So it's like the ultimate weapon.
Yes.
Against heteroskedasticity.
It is.
But it takes a skilled hand to wield it properly.
Exactly. It's not something you'd use for every project.
Okay.
But when applied correctly, it can be incredibly powerful.
I'm really starting to appreciate the range of options we have for dealing with heteroskedasticity.
Yeah.
It's like having a set of specialized tools for all these different scenarios.
Yeah.
Right. But I think the main takeaway for me is that awareness is key.
Absolutely. The first step is recognizing that heteroskedasticity exists.
Right.
And that it can have these serious consequences for our analysis.
Yeah.
And from there, we can choose the most appropriate tool from that toolkit.
Okay.
To deal with it.
And it's striking me that understanding heteroskedasticity goes beyond just statistics.
Yeah.
It's about being a critical thinker. And recognizing that variation is inherent in most of the data that we encounter.
I completely agree, whether you're a researcher, an analyst, or just someone trying to make sense of data in your daily life.
Yeah.
Understanding how that variability can influence conclusions is so valuable.
You know, this whole discussion reminds me of a time when I was working on this project, analyzing the effectiveness of different marketing campaigns. And I initially just, ignored the possibility of heteroskedasticity.
Oh, no.
And it ended up with some pretty misleading results.
I can imagine what happened.
Well, I was looking at the relationship between ad spending and sales conversions. My initial regression model showed this really strong positive correlation. Suggesting that, the more a company spent on ads, the higher their conversion rate.
That sounds promising.
Right.
So what made you kind of question the results?
I started noticing that the relationship seemed way stronger for, larger companies with bigger budgets. And when I dug a little deeper and visualized those residuals, that's when that dreaded funnel shape emerged. And it became clear that I was dealing with heteroskedasticity.
So the variability in conversion rates was being influenced by the size of the company and their ad budget.
Exactly. The bigger spenders just had more room for those fluctuations in their conversion rates. While smaller companies with more limited budgets showed a much tighter relationship.
That makes perfect sense.
So how did you end up addressing the heteroskedasticity in the end? I ended up using robust standard errors because I didn't have a super clear understanding of the exact pattern of variance across all those different company sizes. But it provided a way to at least adjust for it without having to specify a more complex model.
And did that change your conclusions at all?
It did. After accounting for the heteroskedasticity, that relationship between ad spending and conversions became way less significant. It turned out that the initial strong correlation was largely driven by those high-spending outliers.
That's a great example of how ignoring heteroskedasticity can lead to those misinterpretations and potentially bad decisions.
It was definitely a learning experience. But it made me much more aware of how important it is to check for it and use the right tools to address it.
It's a lesson worth sharing. It really highlights how understanding these statistical concepts can have those real-world implications. Helping us to make more informed decisions and avoid common pitfalls.
As we're talking about those real-world implications, I'm realizing that heteroskedasticity probably plays a role in so many different fields. It's not just marketing or finance.
Absolutely not. Think about healthcare.
How does it show up in healthcare?
Imagine researchers are studying the effectiveness of a new drug. They might find that the drug works well on average, but the variability in patient response could be influenced by factors like age, genetics, or even lifestyle choices.
So some patients might see amazing improvement, while others might see little to no effect.
Exactly.
And that variability might be tied back to those individual characteristics.
Yes, and understanding these patterns of heteroskedasticity is crucial for things like, developing personalized treatment plans. And understanding which patients are actually most likely to benefit from that drug.
This is fascinating. We've gone from household spending to marketing campaigns to healthcare. And in each case, heteroskedasticity adds this whole other layer of complexity to the analysis.
And that's why awareness is so important. Once we recognize that variability isn't always constant, we can start asking the right questions and use the right tools to get a clearer picture of what the data is actually telling us.
This has been such a great deep dive. I feel a lot more confident about recognizing and addressing heteroskedasticity now. But before we wrap up completely, I'd love to just get your final thoughts on why this all matters in the bigger picture.
I think what's so fascinating is that in this world, that's just increasingly driven by data. Understanding these nuances can be incredibly empowering. We're just constantly bombarded with statistics, trends, projections, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed or just kind of accept things at face value.
It's like we're expected to trust the numbers without really understanding the methods behind them.
Exactly. But by grasping concepts like heteroskedasticity, we become more informed consumers of data. We can start asking those critical questions like, how was this data collected? Were there any factors that might have influenced the variability? Did the analysis account for those differences?
It's like having this lens that allows us to see beyond the surface.
Yes.
And understand the limitations of any data-driven conclusion.
Precisely. And this ability to think critically about data is essential, not just for like researchers and analysts, but for anyone who really wants to navigate this complex world that we live in.
I love that it's about empowering ourselves to be more discerning and informed citizens.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that data, while incredibly powerful, is not infallible. It's a tool that needs to be used thoughtfully and with an understanding of its limitations.
Well said. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of heteroskedasticity, what are some key takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
First and foremost, remember that variation is natural. It's everywhere.
It is.
And understanding how that variation can change within a data set is crucial for drawing accurate conclusions.
It's like knowing that the ground beneath our feet isn't always perfectly level. We got to adjust our stride accordingly.
Exactly. Second, don't be intimidated by those technical terms. Concepts like heteroskedasticity, while they might sound complex, are ultimately about understanding patterns and relationships in the data. And with a little effort, anyone can grasp these ideas.
And I think our conversation has really proven that.
Yes, we've managed to explore a fairly technical topic in a way that's relatable and engaging, even for those who might have that background in statistics.
And finally, I'm hoping that this deep dive has really encouraged our listeners to kind of embrace curiosity and a healthy skepticism when it comes to data. Don't just accept things at face value. Dig deeper, ask questions, and challenge those assumptions.
It's like we've given them this new set of tools, not just to analyze data, to engage with the world around them in a more informed and insightful way.
This has been such a rewarding exploration.
It has.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into heteroskedasticity.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hopefully you've enjoyed the journey and come away with a newfound appreciation for the nuances of data analysis.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you and our listeners. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and never stop questioning.
See.